the saga of Henry VIII, or how to transform England with 6 matrimonial alliances and an ego larger than Westminster Abbey itself. Imagine, if you will, the misty dawn of 1491 in England, when a robust baby boy entered the world carrying an extraordinary destiny, and quite possibly wearing a smug expression from his very first breath. This remarkable infant was named Henry Tudor, the second son born to the pragmatic and perpetually cautious Henry VII, and his gentle queen, Elizabeth of York. Their marriage was far from a passionate romance novel. It was a calculated political alliance designed to extinguish the bloody wars of the Roses. Nothing says true love quite like ending decades of civil war through strategic matrimony, does it? Little Henry wasn't originally groomed for the throne. That lofty position was reserved for his elder brother Arthur. Yes, named after the legendary king, because the Tudors understood the power of mythological branding centuries before marketing executives did. But fate, in the merciless form of tuberculosis, had alternative designs. Poor Arthur married the Spanish Infanta Catherine of Aragon, only to perish at the tender age of 15, leaving his younger brother to inherit both the crown of England and his widowed sister-in-law. This pattern of Henry taking what wasn't initially his would become something of a lifelong habit, though at this early stage, nobody could have predicted the scale of his future appropriations. But let's not rush ahead. First, allow me to introduce you to young Henry in his prime. He stood impressively tall, over 6 feet, which in Tudor times was practically the equivalent of being a professional basketball player. He possessed broad shoulders that filled his royal doublets magnificently, auburn hair that shimmered like polished mahogany, and piercing blue eyes that seemed to whisper, "Contradict me at your own considerable peril." Handsome, athletic, and radiating the distinct aroma of ambition mixed with roasted venison, young Henry was the Renaissance equivalent of a celebrity heartthrob. His educational accomplishments were equally impressive. Latin, French, theology, music, poetry. He mastered them all with apparent ease. He composed sonnets that weren't half bad, played the lute with surprising skill, wrestled courtiers into submission, sometimes literally, and jousted with the confidence of a man who held a sword in one hand and divine right in the other. In essence, he was a Renaissance powerhouse, with an unwavering belief in his God-given supremacy. Henry's father, the 7th of that name, had been about as exciting as a bowl of cold porridge. Gray, suspicious, and fundamentally unappetizing. So when Henry VII finally relinquished his tight grip on both the kingdom and its treasury in 1509, the 17-year-old Henry VIII ascended to the throne with youthful enthusiasm and a determination to be remembered as the greatest king England had ever known. And what was the first official act of this golden prince? Did he organize a spectacular coronation feast, shower his subjects with gold coins, perhaps dance a royal jig in elaborate hose? No, dear listeners, he married Catherine of Aragon. Yes, the very same Spanish princess who had briefly been his brother's wife. thus commencing one of history's most notorious matrimonial sagas. But before we dive into Henry's complicated marital history, let's examine what kind of monarch he was becoming. In his early years, Henry was genuinely beloved by his people. He embodied youthful energy and generosity, obsessed with chivalric ideals, elaborate pageantry, and positioning himself as Europe's most magnificent sovereign. He hosted feasts that would make modern luxury resorts seem austere by comparison. Picture enormous roasted swans, flowing fountains of wine, and enough velvet to clothe an entire medieval boy band. Music was one of Henry's genuine passions. He not only appreciated it, but composed it himself. One of his most enduring compositions is entitled Pastime with Good Company, which perfectly encapsulated his vision for court life. It's somewhat ironic that this celebration of friendship and loyalty came from a man whose court would eventually become notorious for sycophants, spies, and the occasional severed head. But then again, who hasn't undergone a dramatic personal rebrand by their 40s? Physical activities dominated Henry's leisure hours. Jousting was his particular favorite, the Tudor equivalent of extreme sports. He hunted with enthusiasm, played an archaic version of tennis, real tennis, substantially more complex than the modern game, and maintained his athletic physique with religious dedication. He was essentially a Tudor fitness enthusiast who happened to wear a crown. In religious matters, Henry began his reign as Catholicism's devoted defender. He even authored a theological treatise attacking Martin Luther and defending papal authority, which earned him the papal title Defender of the Faith. In a twist of historical irony that would make Shakespeare chuckle, he would later demolish that same papal relationship and set fire to the established religious order to accommodate his personal desires. Henry firmly believed he was God's divinely appointed king, which conveniently meant that whatever he desired must inherently be morally justified, even when those desires led to decidedly catastrophic outcomes. By his late 30s, Henry's golden prince image had begun to tarnish around the edges. Though still intellectually capable and politically powerful, his once admirable qualities were increasingly overshadowed by impatience, suspicion, and a growing tendency toward tyrannical behavior. His unwavering belief in his own exceptional greatness became increasingly problematic for anyone who failed to reflect this conviction back to him. The punishment for such failure, often a swift separation of head from shoulders. So who was Henry, truly? He was a boy never destined for kingship, who found himself wearing the crown. A young man who initially dazzled his kingdom with promise and potential. A ruler whose craving for legacy, military glory, and male heirs eventually overshadowed his better qualities. He loved music, theology, elaborate armor, and women, though rarely simultaneously, and maintained until his final breath an unshakable conviction that his actions were not merely correct, but divinely ordained. This conviction empowered him to rewrite religious doctrine, fundamentally reshape England's power structures, and reduce his succession of wives to what would eventually become a morbidly catchy rhyme. Speaking of wives, let's turn our attention to Henry's infamous 6 marriages. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. This memorable mnemonic has echoed through the centuries, appearing in everything from history textbooks to Broadway musicals, reducing 6 remarkably complex and intelligent women to their ultimate fates. Yet behind this simplistic rhyme lies an extraordinary tapestry of human drama featuring betrayal, passion, religious upheaval, political maneuvering, and one man's profoundly complicated relationship with women, power, and his own historical legacy. Allow me to illuminate the lives of these 6 queens, each remarkable in her own right. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, divorced, a Spanish princess of impeccable royal lineage. Catherine combined dignity with unwavering religious devotion. She genuinely loved Henry and respected the crown she shared with him for nearly 2 decades. She bore him a daughter, Mary, but no surviving sons, a failure that would eventually doom their union. For 16 years, she served as England's respected queen, displaying grace, intellect, and political acumen. But in Henry's increasingly desperate eyes, her greatest sin was twofold: growing too old to provide the male heir he craved, and possessing too much pride to quietly step aside when commanded. When she refused to accept an annulment and retire to a convent, Henry initiated actions that would change the course of English history, breaking with Rome, establishing the Church of England, and declaring himself its supreme head. Catherine's resistance was as impressive as Henry's determination, making their conflict a genuine clash of titans. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, beheaded. Witty, sharp-tongued, and unabashedly ambitious, Anne refused to follow in her sister Mary's footsteps as the king's mistress. She wanted the crown, and through an extraordinary combination of charm, intelligence, and strategic withholding, she secured it, the very qualities that initially enchanted Henry. Her spirited independence and formidable intellect eventually came to threaten his sense of control. Though she gave him Princess Elizabeth, she failed to produce the all-important male heir. When whispers of adultery, incest, and treason began circulating at court, allegations largely fabricated by her enemies, Henry allowed himself to believe them. In a whirlwind of judicial drama that shocked even Tudor sensibilities, Anne was executed, her brilliant head separated from her body. Yet her ultimate legacy would prove far more enduring than Henry could have imagined. Her daughter Elizabeth would one day become England's most celebrated monarch. Jane Seymour, the third wife, died. Following Anne's tempestuous reign, Jane appeared as the antithesis of her predecessor: submissive, soft-spoken, and strategically demure. Henry declared her his true love, though skeptical historians might suggest this had much to do with her providing what neither of her predecessors could: a healthy male heir, the future Edward VI. Jane's triumph was tragically short-lived. She died from postnatal complications less than 2 weeks after giving birth. Henry genuinely mourned her passing and later requested to be buried beside her. A romantic gesture somewhat undercut by the fact that she never lived long enough to challenge his authority or displease him in any meaningful way. She remains the only one of Henry's wives to receive a queen's funeral while married to him. Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife, divorced. Poor Anne was the victim of perhaps history's most consequential case of misleading portraiture. Henry selected her based on a flattering painting by Hans Holbein, only to declare upon meeting her in person that she resembled a Flanders mare. Hardly the romantic compliment a new bride might hope for. Their marriage was never consummated, with Henry sulking like a child denied his favorite toy. Yet Anne proved herself remarkably astute. Rather than fighting the inevitable, she gracefully accepted an annulment, secured an exceptionally generous settlement, and lived out her days as the king's beloved sister with her own properties, wealth, and most precious of all, freedom from Henry's increasingly volatile moods. Of all his wives, she may have negotiated the most advantageous exit strategy. Catherine Howard, the fifth wife beheaded, a teenager thrust into the deadliest game in England. Catherine was Anne Boleyn's cousin, and arguably Henry's most ill-conceived matrimonial choice. He was approaching 50, corpulent and plagued by a suppurating leg ulcer. She was perhaps 17, vivacious, and woefully unprepared for the responsibilities thrust upon her. She brought youthful excitement to his aging court, but her past romantic entanglements and possibly continuing liaisons eventually came to light. When Henry discovered her indiscretions, he reportedly wept before ordering her execution. The pattern was becoming grimly familiar. Henry's emotional devastation followed swiftly by judicial murder. Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife, survived. Intelligent, educated, and twice widowed, Catherine was more nurse than romantic partner to the king, who by this point was morbidly obese, chronically ill, and notoriously bad-tempered. She cared for his children, soothed his volatile moods, and navigated court politics with remarkable dexterity, secretly harboring Protestant sympathies. She carefully maintained her husband's good graces while subtly promoting religious reform. Catherine's intellectual accomplishments were considerable. She became the first English queen to publish books under her own name. Having outlived the mercurial monarch, she promptly remarried for love, though her hard-won happiness proved short-lived when she died in childbirth the following year. Thus concludes our glimpse into the extraordinary saga of Henry VIII, a man who began as a golden Renaissance prince and ended as a tyrant, who transformed England's religious landscape to satisfy his personal desires, who discarded queens like ill-fitting garments, and who, despite his obsession with securing a male heir, ultimately saw his greatest legacy continue through his daughters. What began as the tale of a charismatic young king evolved into a Shakespearean epic, filled with heartbreak, ambition, betrayal, and those ridiculously puffy sleeves that Tudor fashion inexplicably embraced. But this overview merely scratches the surface of Henry's complex reign. Each of his marriages represents its own fascinating narrative, a unique tapestry of political maneuvering, personal courage, religious conviction, and human frailty. all playing out against the backdrop of an England undergoing its most transformative period. Catherine of Aragon, Queen of Hearts, first wife, an unflinching icon of the Tudor court long before England ever contemplated a dramatic religious break with Rome over matters of divorce and royal succession. A remarkable princess was born in the sun-drenched palaces of Spain. The year was 1485, and the infant girl was christened Catalina de Aragon, daughter of two of the most formidable monarchs Europe had seen in centuries. Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. Yes, those legendary Catholic monarchs. The same Isabella and Ferdinand who orchestrated the final expulsion of the Moors after 7 centuries of Muslim presence in Spain, who established the infamous Spanish Inquisition, who unified the fractured Spanish kingdoms, and who, perhaps most consequentially for world history, financed Christopher Columbus's voyages across the Atlantic. These were not merely rulers. They were empire builders and zealous defenders of Catholic orthodoxy, who believed their royal mission was divinely ordained. Born into this atmosphere of religious fervor and imperial ambition, Catalina, later anglicized to Catherine, was destined for greatness from her very first breath. Royal by birth, warrior by blood, and queen by destiny, her path was laid out before her swaddling clothes were even dry. The little Spanish infanta's education began almost as soon as she could walk, and it was remarkably comprehensive by the standards of any era, particularly for a female royal. Catherine studied Latin with such thoroughness that she would later impress the scholarly courts of Europe with her fluency. Philosophy, history, music, and theology were all part of her rigorous curriculum. By the time most children were still mastering basic reading, she could engage in theological debates that would make seasoned monks reconsider their positions. Her intellectual development took place against the backdrop of Spain's religious and military campaigns, imbuing her with an unshakable conviction that her life's purpose was to serve both God and crown with equal devotion. Beyond her academic accomplishments, Catherine mastered the traditional feminine arts expected of royal women: needlework, dancing, household management, while also developing less conventional skills. She rode horses with remarkable confidence, managed her time with military precision, and developed a spiritual discipline that would sustain her through life's harshest trials. By midday, this princess had typically accomplished more than most courtiers would manage in a week. When Catherine reached the tender age of 15, her parents' grand diplomatic strategies required her to leave behind the orange groves and sunlit courtyards of Spain for the misty, damp shores of England. She was to marry Prince Arthur, the heir apparent to the English throne, son of the shrewd and calculating Henry VII. This matrimonial alliance represented the culmination of years of careful political maneuvering, intended to forge an unbreakable bond between Spain and England against their common French adversary. The wedding festivities were lavish beyond imagination, the political implications even more substantial, as Catherine walked down the aisle in her Spanish finery. The combined courts of both kingdoms anticipated decades of fruitful Anglo-Spanish partnership. The young princess herself, raised to fulfill her royal duties without complaint, entered her marriage with pious determination and the dignified bearing that would become her hallmark. But fate, with its characteristic disregard for human planning, had other designs. Barely 5 months after their wedding, Prince Arthur died suddenly, leaving Catherine a 16-year-old widow in a foreign land where the language, customs, and even the persistent drizzling rain felt alien to her Mediterranean sensibilities. Was it consumption that claimed the young prince? The notoriously damp English climate proving too harsh for his already fragile constitution? Or perhaps the pressures placed upon two adolescents, thrust into adult responsibilities before their bodies and minds were ready? History has never provided a definitive answer. What emerged from this personal tragedy, however, was a declaration from Catherine that would ultimately shape the course of European history. She asserted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. This was not merely a personal disclosure, but a statement of immense political and canonical significance, one that would reverberate through the halls of power for decades to come. Following Arthur's death, Catherine found herself trapped in a diplomatic purgatory that would test even the most resilient spirit. Technically still a princess, she was nonetheless reduced to a living chess piece on the grand board of European politics, valuable for her connections, but increasingly problematic to maintain. The question of her dowry became entangled in complex negotiations between her father and her late husband's father, neither of whom was willing to relinquish financial advantage. For 7 long years, Catherine endured this limbo, living in increasingly reduced circumstances as her status remained unresolved. The once pampered Spanish infanta learned harsh lessons about the precariousness of royal favor and the cold calculations that governed dynastic politics. Yet throughout this ordeal, she maintained her dignity, her faith, and her unwavering belief that God had preserved her for some greater purpose. That purpose revealed itself in 1509 when Henry VII died, and his second son, the vibrant, athletic 17-year-old Henry VIII, ascended to the English throne. Among his first royal decisions was to fulfill what he claimed had been his father's deathbed wish, to marry Catherine. She was 23 by then, 5 years his senior, still beautiful with her auburn hair and delicate features, and carrying the valuable Spanish alliance in her diplomatic portfolio. For a time, they appeared to be England's golden couple. Catherine blossomed as Queen of England, embodying the role with natural grace and intelligence. She was dignified in public, compassionate toward the poor, and meticulous in observing court ceremonial. The people adored her authentic piety and genuine concern for their welfare. She established charitable foundations, patronized scholars, and brought Spanish artistic influences to the English court, enriching its cultural landscape. Catherine's finest hour as queen came during the summer of 1513, when Henry ventured to France to wage war. leaving her as regent of England. While heavily pregnant, she organized England's defenses against a Scottish invasion led by King James IV, an ally of France seeking to capitalize on Henry's absence. The English forces, fighting under Catherine's banner, crushed the Scottish army at the Battle of Flodden Field, killing the Scottish king and thousands of his nobles. Catherine, displaying the warrior blood of her Spanish ancestors, sent the blood-stained coat of the dead Scottish king to her husband in France as a trophy. This remarkable woman had proved herself not merely a consort, but a formidable ruler in her own right. Yet beneath this glittering success lay a growing shadow. Despite at least 6 pregnancies over the years, only one child survived infancy, Princess Mary, born in 1516. For a Renaissance monarch obsessed with securing the Tudor dynasty, the lack of a male heir represented not merely a personal disappointment, but a potential catastrophe for the kingdom. Though Catherine maintained her serene faith that God's will would eventually provide them with a son, Henry grew increasingly anxious and superstitious. As Catherine approached her 40s and the possibility of further children dimmed, Henry began to engage in extraordinary mental gymnastics. He convinced himself that their failure to produce a male heir represented divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow, conveniently forgetting that he himself had eagerly pursued the marriage. He began scouring biblical passages, particularly from Leviticus, suggesting that such a marriage was against God's law. The fact that a specific papal dispensation had been granted to allow the marriage was increasingly dismissed in Henry's tortured reasoning. The situation transformed from awkward to catastrophic with the arrival of Anne Boleyn at court, young, vivacious, and unwilling to become merely another royal mistress. As Henry's infatuation with Anne grew, so did his determination to end his marriage to Catherine. What followed was unprecedented in European history. A king challenging the Pope's authority and eventually breaking with Rome entirely, all to dissolve a marriage that had lasted over 20 years. Catherine's response to this crisis revealed her true character. She refused to accept the validity of any annulment proceedings, maintaining with unwavering conviction that she was Henry's true and lawful wife. When summoned before an ecclesiastical court at Blackfriars in 1529, she delivered one of history's most powerful speeches in her own defense. Kneeling before Henry, her voice steady despite her breaking heart, she declared, "I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife, ever conformable to your will and pleasure. And if there be any just cause by the law that you can allege against me, I am contented to depart, to my great shame and dishonor. But if there be none, then I pray you let me receive justice at your hands." When the proceedings continued despite her appeal, Catherine rose from her knees, walked directly past the assembled cardinals without acknowledging their authority, and departed the court, never to return to the proceedings. It was an act of extraordinary courage and conviction that impressed even her enemies. But Henry's determination proved implacable. When the Pope refused to grant his annulment, he proceeded to break England from the Catholic Church entirely, establishing himself as supreme head of the newly formed Church of England. By 1533, his marriage to Catherine was declared null and void by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, Henry's newly appointed ecclesiastical authority. The final years of Catherine's life were marked by cruel hardships deliberately imposed to break her spirit. She was stripped of her title as queen, separated from her beloved daughter Mary, and sent to live in a series of increasingly isolated and unhealthy castles. Her household was reduced, her movements restricted, and her letters to her daughter frequently intercepted. Yet through it all, she maintained her dignity and her position, signing her letters Catherine the Queen until her dying day. She died at Kimbolton Castle in January 1536, at the age of 50, alone but spiritually unbroken. When her body was examined, her heart was found to be blackened, leading some to whisper suspicions of poison. Historians today generally attribute this to cancer, but the poetic justice of a heart blackened by sorrow appeals to our sense of narrative symmetry. Catherine of Aragon embodied unwavering loyalty to her God, her crown, and her daughter. She was intelligent, politically astute, and deeply beloved by the English people throughout her trials. Even in exile, she conducted herself with the unmistakable bearing of royalty and the unbreakable will of her warrior ancestors. Though she lost her crown and her husband, she never surrendered her sense of self or her conviction in the righteousness of her cause. Her legacy would continue through her daughter Mary, who would eventually take the English throne and attempt, during her brief reign, to restore the Catholicism her mother had so steadfastly defended. Catherine's bloodline would briefly illuminate the English throne once more, a testament to the enduring strength of a Spanish princess who refused to be discarded, even by a king who remade a nation to be rid of her. In the verdant, rolling hills of Kent, sometime during the closing years of the 15th century, a baby girl drew her first breath, a child who would one day shatter centuries of religious tradition and transform the very foundation of England's power structure. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and while historians still debate whether she was born in 1501 or as late as 1507, what remains indisputable is that this remarkable woman would reshape a kingdom not through military conquest or royal birthright, but through the far more subtle weapons of intellect, charm, and an unwavering determination to rise beyond the station society prescribed for her. The Boleyns were not royalty, far from it. They belonged to that ambitious, upwardly mobile class that orbited the true nobility, always reaching higher. Anne's father, Thomas Boleyn, was a consummate diplomat with a silver tongue and relentless ambition, a man who understood that in Tudor England, power was a fluid commodity that could be acquired through service, strategy, and strategic marriage alliances. Her mother, Elizabeth Howard, came from the prestigious Howard family, bringing connections to one of England's most ancient noble bloodlines. Together, they provided Anne with something perhaps more valuable than a royal cradle. They gave her opportunity, unlike many daughters of Tudor gentry who received minimal education, focused primarily on household management and religious instruction. Anne's formative years were shaped by international exposure and intellectual stimulation, rather than being raised to be merely decorative or docile. She was cultivated to captivate. Her parents, recognizing her quick intelligence and natural charisma, invested in her potential in a way uncommon for daughters of that era. At a remarkably young age, Anne was sent abroad to serve in some of Europe's most sophisticated courts. Her education began in earnest at the court of the Archduchess Margaret of Austria in the Netherlands, a cultured environment where young ladies were taught languages, music, dance, and the intricate art of courtly etiquette. There, surrounded by Flemish art, multilingual conversation, and the political machinations of one of Europe's most powerful women, Anne absorbed lessons in diplomacy and self-presentation that would serve her throughout her meteoric rise. Her continental education continued in France, where she served Queen Claude, wife of the flamboyant Renaissance monarch King Francis I. The French court of the early 16th century was a vibrant center of cultural innovation, intellectual freedom, and refined seduction. It was here that Anne truly flourished, immersing herself in French fashion, literature, music, and the philosophical ideas of early Renaissance humanism. She learned to converse not merely with propriety, but with wit and allure, developing that distinctive blend of intelligence and charm that would later captivate a king. When Anne finally returned to England around 1522, she was transformed. She moved with continental grace, dressed with French sophistication, and spoke with an eloquence seasoned by years abroad. She was not conventionally beautiful by Tudor standards, which preferred pale skin and golden hair. Instead, Anne possessed what contemporaries described as a magnetic allure: dark, expressive eyes that could convey volumes without a word, olive-toned skin that hinted at exotic mystery, and a long, elegant neck that she accentuated with her signature, be necklace or a simple ribbon. But Anne's most powerful attribute was never her appearance. It was her presence, a combination of quick intelligence, artistic sensibility, and an uncanny ability to make whoever she spoke with feel momentarily like the most important person in the room. She could discuss theology with scholars, exchange literary references with poets, and engage in the subtle verbal fencing that passed for flirtation in Tudor courtly circles. Her arrival at Henry VIII's court coincided with a period when the king, approaching his 30s, was growing increasingly dissatisfied. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon had produced only one living child, a daughter, Mary, and Henry's obsession with securing a male heir was becoming all-consuming. His eye had already wandered numerous times, including a dalliance with Anne's own sister, Mary Boleyn, who had briefly been his mistress before being set aside like many others before her. Anne, however, rewrote the rules of royal courtship. When Henry's attention turned to her, she did something unprecedented. She refused him. Unlike her sister and countless others who had acquiesced to becoming the king's temporary companion, Anne made it clear that she would not be another name in the long ledger of royal conquests. If Henry wanted her, he would need to offer something no English king had done for a common-born subject before: marriage and a crown. This audacious stance initiated what would become one of history's most consequential love affairs. Henry, accustomed to immediate gratification in all things, found himself utterly captivated by the one woman at court who dared say no to him. He pursued her with an intensity that transformed from royal whim to all-consuming passion. His love letters to Anne, some of which survive today, reveal a man besotted beyond reason, pleading, promising, and proclaiming a devotion that swept aside all political calculation. For Anne, navigating this royal infatuation required extraordinary skill. The stakes could not have been higher. To become a king's mistress might bring temporary favor and gifts, but history had shown such women were easily discarded once their novelty faded. To aim for marriage, especially when the king already had a queen, was to risk everything on a nearly impossible gamble. Yet Anne held firm, maintaining a delicate balance between encouraging Henry's affection and preserving her virtue until marriage could be secured. Henry's determination to marry Anne set in motion a chain of events that would forever alter England's relationship with the wider Christian world. His request to Pope Clement VII for an annulment of his marriage to Catherine was not merely a personal matter, but a diplomatic crisis of the highest order. Catherine was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, who effectively controlled the Pope through military dominance of Italy. The resulting stalemate, with the Pope unwilling to grant Henry's request, but equally unwilling to deny it outright, dragged on for years, during which Anne's position grew increasingly precarious. The solution Henry eventually embraced was revolutionary beyond measure. Guided by Thomas Cromwell and others who saw opportunity in religious reform, Henry gradually embraced the radical notion that the English monarch, not the distant Pope in Rome, should be the supreme authority over the Church in England. The Act of Supremacy passed in 1534 formalized this break, making Henry the supreme head of the Church of England and effectively launching the English Reformation, though its theological underpinnings would continue to evolve long after Anne's death. In January 1533, with the religious break well underway, but not yet complete, Henry and Anne were married in a secret ceremony. By then, Anne was already pregnant, adding urgency to Henry's determination to have their future child recognized as legitimate. In June of that year, now visibly expecting, Anne was crowned Queen of England in a lavish ceremony at Westminster Abbey. She processed through London streets decorated for the occasion, though contemporary accounts note that the public response was muted. Many still considered Catherine the rightful queen, and Anne was viewed by some as an interloper or worse. When September arrived and Anne gave birth, the child was healthy and strong. But a daughter, not the son Henry had convinced himself would justify all his actions. They named her Elizabeth, and while Anne doted on her immediately, recognizing the child's quick intelligence that mirrored her own. Henry barely concealed his disappointment. The daughter who would one day be celebrated as England's greatest monarch was, at her birth, seen primarily as a political setback. Anne's tenure as queen was brief and increasingly troubled, having achieved the seemingly impossible, rising from gentleman's daughter to crowned queen. She found that maintaining her position was even more challenging. The court that had once adapted to her ascendancy was filled with enemies waiting for her to stumble. Her outspoken nature and involvement in political and religious matters. She was a genuine supporter of church reform and promoted evangelical texts, made her powerful enemies. Her relationship with Henry, once passionate beyond reason, began to cool as the pattern of her pregnancies echoed Catherine's. A living daughter followed by miscarriages. Her second pregnancy ended tragically in 1536, possibly triggered by the shock of seeing Henry thrown from his horse in a jousting accident, or by learning of his growing interest in one of her ladies-in-waiting, the demure Jane Seymour. The whisper campaign against Anne grew louder. Courtiers who had never accepted her now found a more receptive audience for their complaints. Thomas Cromwell, once her ally, came to see her as an obstacle to his political goals, and Henry, whose affections were notoriously fickle, began to convince himself that this marriage, too, had somehow been cursed. The end came with shocking swiftness. In May 1536, Anne was arrested and taken to the Tower of London on charges so outrageous they betrayed their political motivation. Adultery with multiple men, including her own brother George Boleyn, conspiracy against the king, and treason. Modern historians generally agree these charges were fabricated, part of a court conspiracy to remove Anne and allow Henry to pursue marriage with Jane Seymour. Anne's trial was a mere formality. Her guilt had been determined before the first witness was called. Yet even facing certain death, she defended herself with remarkable eloquence and composure. Those present recorded their admiration for her dignity, even as they participated in her destruction. Found guilty on all charges, she was sentenced to death, with Henry commuting the traditional burning for treason to beheading, and importing a skilled swordsman from France to ensure the execution would be swift and clean. His final gift to the woman he had once moved heaven and earth to marry. On the morning of May 19, 1536, Anne walked to the scaffold erected within the Tower of London. Dressed in a dark gown and her distinctive French hood, she addressed the assembled crowd with a speech that was a masterpiece of political calculation. Even at the end, Anne understood the power of public perception. She praised the king as a gentle and sovereign lord, and asked the people to pray for him. Whether this reflected genuine feeling, or a final attempt to protect her daughter's future position, remains one of history's enigmas. With quiet dignity, she knelt, repeating, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul," before the sword separated her head from her body in a single stroke. She was approximately 35 years old, had been queen for just under 3 years, and left behind a daughter not yet 3 years old who would one day eclipse both her parents in historical significance. Anne Boleyn's physical life ended that May morning, but her influence was only beginning. The religious reforms her marriage had necessitated would evolve into the distinct Anglican tradition. Her daughter Elizabeth would reign for 44 years, in what would be celebrated as a golden age of English power and cultural achievement. And the image of Anne herself would be continuously reinvented through the centuries. Villain, victim, feminist icon, and political genius, Anne was neither saint nor sinner, but something far more compelling. A woman of extraordinary ability, born in an age that rarely allowed women to exercise power openly. She was ambitious in an era when female ambition was considered monstrous. Intelligent when women's intellects were routinely dismissed. And determined in a world designed to break women's will to anything beyond submission. That she rose so high and fell so catastrophically speaks not just to her personal story, but to the precarious nature of power itself in Tudor England. The traditional rhyme about Henry's wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, reduces Anne to just one word in a sequence. But the truth is far richer. She was a catalyst who changed the course of English history. A revolutionary wrapped in courtly manners and silk gowns. Though the executioner's sword silenced her voice, her legacy continues to whisper across the centuries, reminding us that sometimes the most profound changes come not from those born to power, but from those determined enough to seize it against all odds. And as Anne's story concludes, another begins, that of Jane Seymour, the woman who stood in stark contrast to Anne's brilliance and boldness. Quiet where Anne was outspoken, yielding where Anne was defiant. Jane would give Henry the one prize that had eluded both his previous queens, a living son. But that, dear listener, is another story in the turbulent saga of Tudor England. In a world of burning ambitions, inflated egos, and the endless chess game of power politics, Jane Seymour stepped into history not with the roar of a storm, but with the whisper of a breeze, gentle, silken, and touched by an unassuming determination that would, in time, capture a king's heart and carve her place in the chaotic tapestry of the Tudor court. Jane was not a great beauty, nor a fierce intellect. She wasn't a scandalous enchantress who danced through rumors or a towering political force. She was not a revolution like Anne Boleyn, or a regal powerhouse like Catherine of Aragon. Jane was something far rarer within Henry's orbit. She was quiet, cautious, and clever enough to survive, if only for a while. Born around the year 1508 at Wolf Hall in Wiltshire, Jane came from an old, respected noble family, though far less ambitious and ostentatious than the Boleyns. Her father, Sir John Seymour, was a loyal servant of the crown, while her mother, Marjorie Wentworth, was known for her gentle wisdom and deep piety. Jane was one of many children raised in a household where discipline, obedience, and modesty were the highest virtues, values that seemed to take root in Jane more deeply than in most. Unlike her predecessor Anne, who spoke French, Latin, and could wield sarcasm like a blade, Jane's talents were more domestic: needlework, music, and the quiet art of household management. Yet she possessed a power that was subtle but formidable. Jane understood the strength of silence. She knew how to listen without speaking, how to watch without intruding, how to navigate dangerous rooms without leaving footprints. In the treacherous halls of Henry's court, this skill was nothing short of lethal. She first served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine of Aragon, and later to Anne Boleyn. From this privileged vantage point, she witnessed the rise and brutal fall of two queens. Catherine's steadfast loyalty was rewarded with a cold dismissal, while Anne's meteoric climb crumbled under the weight of miscarriages and shifting political winds. Jane watched, and she waited. While Anne fought fiercely for her crown, Jane positioned herself with quiet care, always present but never too close. She accepted Henry's gifts with a demure smile, but refused to become his mistress. Some say she was a pawn, moved by her ambitious brothers, Edward and Thomas Seymour, who saw in her a path to power. Others believe Jane herself played the game with a quiet, calculating grace. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: Henry fell hard. As Anne's fortunes faltered, Jane's star rose. By May of 1536, Anne was gone, her head taken on charges that continue to haunt history. 11 days later, Henry married Jane. No grand celebration, no long mourning, just a swift turn from one queen's grave to another's bridal chamber. As queen, Jane was everything Anne was not: meek, mild, and politically cautious. She restored order to the royal household, mended the strained relationship between Henry and his estranged daughter Mary, and quietly used her influence where it mattered. Only once did she dare to challenge Henry, pleading for the restoration of Catholic monasteries. His icy rebuke reminded her of the dangers of stepping beyond her quiet shadow. But it was in motherhood that Jane's legacy would be truly written. In the autumn of 1537, she endured an agonizing 2-day labor to deliver what Henry had long craved: a healthy, legitimate male heir, Prince Edward. Yet the joy was short-lived. Weakened by the grueling birth, Jane succumbed to childbed fever just 12 days later. Her death plunged the court into genuine mourning. Even Henry, a man rarely touched by grief unless it came with rage, mourned her deeply. He wore black for months, delayed remarriage, and insisted Jane was his true wife, the one who gave him his long-desired son. When his own end came, he ordered to be buried beside her. Jane Seymour, who ruled for only 17 months, left no scandal, no rebellion, no disgrace. But she secured her place in history. In a court of roaring lions and shrieking hawks, she was the quiet, watchful dove, elusive, graceful, and gone too soon. In the uncertain world of 16th century Europe, where alliances shifted like autumn leaves and crowns balanced on the edge of ambition, Anne of Cleves grew up far from the glittering chaos of the English court. Born in 1515 in the quiet, disciplined Duchy of Cleves, a region nestled in what is now Germany. She was the daughter of John III, Duke of Cleves, and Maria of Jülichburg. Anne's upbringing was not the stuff of grand balls or whispered intrigues. Hers was a world of modesty and decorum, where noble daughters learned to manage households, to sew with skill, and to conduct themselves with grace, lessons of humility rather than flirtation. Across the sea, King Henry VIII of England was once again searching for a wife. By the year 1539, he had already been thrice married, divorced from Catherine of Aragon, seen Anne Boleyn condemned to death, and lost Jane Seymour to the cruel grasp of childbed fever. Now nearing 50, Henry was not the golden prince of his youth, but a man marked by frustration, ailing health, and a growing desperation for alliances. In this volatile world, the Protestant Duchy of Cleves seemed a perfect partner, and Anne's name soon appeared on the list of eligible brides. But Henry, ever the romantic and certainly not shallow at all, wanted to know what he was agreeing to. Hans Holbein, the court's master painter, was dispatched to Cleves to capture Anne's likeness. The portrait that returned to England was flattering. A serene, composed young woman with a gentle smile. Smitten by the image, Henry agreed to the marriage. In January of 1540, Anne arrived in England. Her journey across the cold, churning waters was just the beginning of a much more treacherous voyage. Henry, excited like a restless actor in one of his own pageants, decided to surprise her. He burst into her chambers in disguise, a game of romantic mischief that had once charmed other women. But Anne, raised in a world where such displays were unthinkable, did not recognize him. Her polite confusion struck Henry like a blow. Humiliated and angered, he quickly decided she was nothing like the beauty he had imagined. Yet the wheels of politics were already turning. The marriage took place on January 6, 1540, but the union was a disaster. Henry claimed he could not consummate the marriage, making cruel remarks about her appearance behind closed doors, though many found Anne pleasant enough. But where others might have wept, begged, or fought, Anne did something remarkable. She agreed to the annulment. In a world where wives of Henry often met bitter ends, Anne of Cleves played her hand with brilliant caution. She accepted the annulment graciously, citing pre-contracts and lack of consummation. And in return, she secured a generous settlement, palaces, lands, jewels, and the honorable title of the king's beloved sister. She remained in England, a respected figure who outlived Henry, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. History has often remembered Anne as the ugly wife, a brief mistake between the drama of Anne Boleyn and the tragedy of Catherine Howard. But that is a gross misjudgment. Anne was wise, adaptable, and far more successful than most who dared to wed the dangerous King Henry. She kept her head, her fortune, and her peace. And so, in a court where lives could be ended with a whispered accusation or a swinging blade, Anne of Cleves did the unimaginable. She walked away, free, respected, and content. In the shadow of Tudor grandeur, where crowns weighed heavy and royal favor meant life or death, there once danced a girl whose laughter echoed briefly through palace halls before silence fell. Catherine Howard, a crown without a future, a young woman who fluttered too close to dangerous flames. The year was 1540, not long after Anne of Cleves had gracefully stepped away from Henry's suffocating embrace. Like a sweet perfume carried on summer breeze, Catherine drifted into the royal court, vibrant, intoxicating, and utterly destined for tragedy. While courtiers whispered behind jeweled hands, this girl with chestnut hair and dimpled smile caught the wandering eye of a king thrice her age, a monarch whose love had already proven deadlier than his hate. Born around 1523, a date that makes historians sigh with frustration for its uncertainty. Catherine was the daughter of Lord Edmund Howard, a nobleman whose family name carried far more weight than his purse. The Howards were aristocratic, but stretched thin across England's landscape, their fortunes scattered like autumn leaves. More troublingly, Catherine bore the blood of the Boleyns in her veins. She was cousin to the infamous Anne, who had worn a crown before losing her head. Such kinship should have come with warnings etched in crimson. When Catherine was still small enough to hide in window alcoves, her mother passed into memory's embrace, leaving behind a girl with no maternal guidance in a world that devoured the unprepared. Lord Edmund Howard, drowning in debts and responsibilities, made the decision countless nobles before him had made. He sent his daughter away. Catherine found herself delivered to Lambeth Palace, home of her step-grandmother, the formidable Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, Agnes Howard. The Duchess's household was what polite historians might call inadequately supervised, and what others would describe as deliciously chaotic. Young ladies of good families were sent there to learn the arts of nobility: embroidery, music, dancing, and conversation. But the Duchess kept her attention elsewhere, leaving her charges to educate themselves in matters far beyond needlework. It was within these walls that Catherine, barely 13 summers old, first encountered the intoxicating dance of courtship. The girls' dormitory, separated from the young men's quarters by nothing more substantial than ancient tradition, became a playground for midnight whispers and stolen moments. Two men in particular left their mark on Catherine's young heart: Henry Manox, her music teacher whose fingers lingered too long when correcting her lute playing, and Francis Derryham, whose ambitions matched his boldness. Whether Catherine's relationships with these men were romantic dalliances or something more serious remains the subject of scholarly debate. What cannot be disputed is that within the Duchess's household, Catherine was already entangled in a web of secrets and passions long before she ever set eyes upon a king. In 1540, Catherine's world transformed with dizzying speed. At approximately 17 years old, she secured a position as lady-in-waiting to the newly crowned Queen Anne of Cleves. The royal court, with its tapestries soaked in perfume and intrigue, became her stage. There, amidst whispers and calculated glances, King Henry VIII, once Europe's golden prince, now 50 years old with a festering leg wound and wounded pride, noticed the laughing girl with dancing eyes. To Henry, whose mirror showed only what he feared to see, Catherine Howard was a miracle. She radiated youth when his body betrayed him daily. She giggled at his jokes and gazed upon him with apparent adoration when others flinched at his approach. Whether Catherine's affection was genuine or expertly performed remains one of history's unresolvable mysteries. But the aging king found in her what he desperately sought, a reflection of his former glory. With characteristic impatience, Henry moved to possess this new treasure. On July 28, 1540, a mere 19 days after annulling his marriage to Anne of Cleves, Henry wed Catherine Howard in private chambers at Oatlands Palace. The bride, not yet 20, became queen of a realm she barely understood, married to a man who required servants to hoist him onto his horse, and whose temper could shift like England's notorious weather. For a time, Catherine wore her crown with apparent ease. She danced through court festivities with natural grace, showered her increasingly infatuated husband with affection, and called him her rose without a thorn. An ironic endearment for a man whose previous wives had discovered just how sharp his thorns could be. She revitalized the court with youth and laughter, turning the palace clocks back to Henry's golden years. Catherine's family, the ambitious Howards, led by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, saw her as their path back to supreme power, a counterweight to the rising influence of reformist factions at court. The girl who had once been too insignificant to merit proper supervision now held the king's heart in her small hands. But palace floors are treacherous, and Catherine's past refused to remain buried. Francis Dereham, emboldened by the knowledge of their former intimacies, appeared at court seeking position. Whether from naivety, compassion, or fear of exposure, Catherine appointed him as her personal secretary, a catastrophic miscalculation that placed her former lover in daily proximity. More dangerous still was Thomas Culpeper, a handsome gentleman of the king's privy chamber who caught Catherine's eye. While Henry's health declined and his absences grew longer, Catherine began meeting Culpeper in secret, their rendezvous facilitated by Lady Jane Rochford, the same Jane who had testified against her own husband and sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn, years before. Whether Catherine and Culpeper's relationship was romantic, physical, or merely imprudent friendship, it represented a fatal gamble. Their meetings occurred behind closed doors during the royal progress of 1541, while the king's physicians tended to his suppurating leg. In court, where walls had ears and servants' loyalty was purchasable, whispers of the Queen's indiscretions eventually reached Archbishop Thomas Cranmer. Recognizing both danger and opportunity, Cranmer carefully gathered evidence before approaching the king with a letter containing allegations that would shatter Henry's world. The king, who had once proclaimed Catherine his rose of youth, initially refused to believe her betrayal. He wept, raged, and demanded proof. When confronted with incriminating letters between Catherine and Culpeper, along with testimonies from household members, Henry's heartbreak crystallized into fury. Catherine was stripped of her royal title and confined under guard, while investigations intensified. Unlike her cousin Anne Boleyn, who had faced death with remarkable composure, Catherine collapsed under the weight of her circumstances. She was moved to Sion Abbey, where her hysteria grew with each passing day. As evidence mounted against her, Parliament passed an Act of Attainder making it treason for a queen to fail to disclose her sexual history to the king within 20 days of their marriage, or to incite someone to call her an adulteress. This legislation, created specifically to entrap Catherine, made her fate inevitable. Francis Dereham suffered a traitor's death of hanging, drawing and quartering. Thomas Culpeper, granted mercy due to his previous favor with the king, was merely beheaded. Catherine watched winter descend from her prison windows, knowing spring would arrive without her. On February 13th, 1542, Catherine Howard walked her final steps, dressed in black velvet, her hair, traditionally unbound for an unmarried woman, though she had been a queen, flowed around her shoulders. According to witnesses, she spent the night before practicing how to place her head upon the block, determined to die with dignity even as fear consumed her. Her final speech was brief, acknowledging her deserved punishment, though whether for actual adultery or merely concealment of her past remains debated. The executioner's blade fell, and Catherine Howard became the second of Henry's queens to surrender her life before reaching her 21st year. Catherine Howard's tragedy lies not merely in how she died, but in how little chance she had to truly live. Never properly guided, thrown into the deadliest game in England without understanding its rules, she made mistakes that many young women might make. But hers happened on history's most unforgiving stage. She was no calculated schemer, no master manipulator, but rather a girl raised in aristocratic neglect, taught that her value lay in pleasing powerful men, then punished with death when the most powerful man of all discovered he wasn't the only one she had pleased. In the 5 centuries since her execution, Catherine has often been portrayed as foolish, frivolous, even deserving of her fate. But perhaps she deserves to be remembered differently. As a young woman who brought joy and laughter to a court grown grim, who danced and loved freely in a world determined to cage her, and who, in the end, paid the ultimate price for the crime of being human in an inhuman time. The candle gutters low now, the Tudor court fades into shadow, but somewhere beyond time's veil, a young queen still dances, her laughter echoing through history's hushed corridors, remembered not as Henry's greatest folly, but as Catherine Howard, who lived and loved too briefly in a dangerous age. Some women are born with crowns seemingly destined for their brows, while others find themselves wearing royal circlets through life's curious twists and unforeseen turns. Catherine Parr, the 6th and final wife of Henry VIII, most certainly belonged to the latter category. A woman who became queen not because she yearned for power, but because she possessed too much wisdom, strength, and practical competence to evade history's spotlight. When Henry's royal attention turned in her direction, less a romantic pursuit and more a lumbering inevitability, Catherine wasn't some wide-eyed maiden with dreams of palace grandeur. By then, she had already navigated her way through 2 marriages, witnessed the ravages of plague, weathered the tempestuous religious upheavals tearing through Tudor England, and accumulated enough life experience to recognize that becoming the wife of a king known for dispatching his spouses to divorce, exile, or the executioner's block was hardly the safest of prospects. Yet into this dangerous dance she stepped, not for love or ambition, but because refusing a king's proposal was itself a perilous path. Her story unfolds not as a fairy tale romance, but as a masterclass in survival, intelligence, and subtle power wrapped in Tudor finery. Catherine Parr entered the world in 1512, born into England's educated gentry. Her father, Sir Thomas Parr, moved in royal circles as a trusted courtier and confidant to Henry VIII. Yes, the very same monarch who would later claim his daughter as a bride, for such were the entangled webs of Tudor society. Her mother, Maud Green, served as lady-in-waiting to Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, and instilled in young Catherine not just the requisite courtly graces, but a profound appreciation for the Spanish queen's dignified resilience, a quality that would later prove invaluable to Catherine herself. Unlike many aristocratic children who received only superficial education, Catherine benefited from her parents' humanist values. She studied languages, theology, history, and philosophy with an intensity unusual for women of her era. By adulthood, she was fluent in Latin, Greek, French, and Italian, intellectual accomplishments that positioned her among England's most learned women, regardless of rank or station. Life dealt Catherine early lessons in loss when her father died, while she was still young. At merely 15 years old, practical concerns rather than romantic inclinations guided her into her first marriage to Edward Burrough, the elderly and sickly son of Lord Burrough. This union, arranged for family advantage rather than affection, cast Catherine as nurse more often than wife. When Burrough died after just a few years, Catherine, still barely into her 20s, found herself a widow responsible for managing substantial household affairs, a task she executed with remarkable competence. Her second husband, John Neville, Lord Latimer, brought not just his name but complications. As a northern nobleman caught between the crown's demands and the Catholic rebels during the pilgrimage of Grace Uprising, Latimer's precarious position placed Catherine in political crosshairs. The rebellion, which swept across northern England in 1536 as a reaction against Henry's religious reforms, saw Latimer temporarily held hostage by insurgents. Catherine navigated these dangerous waters with a diplomat's tact, somehow keeping both her husband and herself in the king's fluctuating good graces. These years molded Catherine into a formidable woman who managed estates, stepchildren, and political intrigues with equal skill. She absorbed the religious currents swirling through England, not merely accepting the traditional Catholicism of her youth, but engaging deeply with the Protestant reforms spreading through Europe like wildfire, dividing nations and turning neighbors into either enlightened allies or dangerous heretics, depending on which theological winds prevailed at court. By the time Lord Latimer succumbed to illness, Catherine was 30 years old, considered past prime marrying age in Tudor England, twice widowed, childless yet experienced in mothering stepchildren, and financially secure. She appeared content to embrace a future of quiet scholarly pursuits and private religious devotion. Fate, however, had royal designs in store. The Henry VIII, who set his sights on Catherine Parr in 1543, was hardly the golden prince of earlier years. At 53, he had become a physical wreck, obese and barely mobile, plagued by an ulcerated leg that oozed continually and filled rooms with its putrid smell. His temper, never particularly even, had curdled into unpredictable outbursts, punctuated by paranoid suspicions. He had buried 2 wives, divorced 2 others, and beheaded 1. By any rational measure, becoming his 6th queen ranked somewhere between unappealing and terrifying. Yet Henry noticed in Catherine qualities increasingly precious to him as his health deteriorated. Intelligence without scheming, piety without fanaticism, and a serene dignity that promised no dramatic scandals. By all accounts, she was tall with fair coloring, attractive in a composed rather than flashy manner. After 5 previous marriages that had delivered various combinations of political disaster, personal heartbreak, and public embarrassment, Catherine's steady competence seemed a balm to the aging king. What Henry didn't know, what would have infuriated him had he discovered it, was that Catherine's heart belonged elsewhere. She had developed genuine affection for Thomas Seymour, the dashing and ambitious brother of the late Queen Jane Seymour, Henry's 3rd wife, who had died giving birth to his only legitimate son. The Tudor court truly was an enclosed ecosystem, where the same family names circulated through power like blood through veins. When the King of England proposes marriage, however, even if he resembles nothing so much as a festering wound clothed in royal velvet, refusal is not among the available options. Catherine accepted her fate with outward grace, inwardly surrendering her hopes for a love match with Seymour. On July 12, 1543, she became Queen of England in a small ceremony at Hampton Court Palace. As queen, Catherine constructed a court that differed markedly from those of her predecessors. Where others had emphasized spectacle, she cultivated intellectual engagement. She gathered around her scholars, poets, and religious thinkers. Music and dance certainly featured in her household, but so did theological debates and literary discussions. This was no accident. Catherine deliberately created a cultured environment where her stepchildren could flourish intellectually. Her relationship with Henry's children represented perhaps her greatest achievement, and certainly her most delicate balancing act. Princess Mary, older than Catherine herself and devoutly Catholic, initially viewed her new stepmother with suspicion. The young Elizabeth, already showing signs of her brilliant mind, was starved for maternal guidance, and Edward, the precious male heir upon whom all Tudor hopes rested, required nurturing that wouldn't undermine his kingly education. Somehow, Catherine managed to connect with all 3, helping heal family fractures that Henry's marital chaos had created. Under her influence, Henry reconciled with his daughters, formally reinstating them in the line of succession. A diplomatic triumph that would eventually prove crucial to England's future. She particularly bonded with Elizabeth, encouraging the princess's formidable intellect and providing a model of female accomplishment that would influence Elizabeth's own rule decades later. Perhaps most remarkably for a queen of that era, Catherine became a published author. Her Prayers or Meditations became the first work published by an English queen under her own name, an astonishing achievement in a time when female authorship was viewed with deep suspicion. The book, a collection of devotional reflections, became something of a Tudor bestseller. She followed this with The Lamentation of a Sinner, a more explicitly Protestant work published after Henry's death, which revealed the full extent of her reformed theological positions. Catherine's intellectual and religious interests, however, nearly proved her undoing. As Henry's health declined further, conservative factions at court viewed her growing influence with alarm. Her habit of engaging the king in theological discussions, something Henry had once enjoyed as it allowed him to display his own considerable learning, became reframed by her enemies as dangerous meddling by an overreaching woman. In 1546, with Henry's body and mind increasingly unreliable, powerful conservatives, including Stephen Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, and Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley, plotted Catherine's downfall. They convinced the king that his wife harbored dangerous heretical ideas. Rumors suggest that a warrant for her arrest was actually drawn up, signed. And then, in one of history's most fortuitous accidents, dropped where Catherine's supporters discovered it. Warned of her peril, Catherine demonstrated political instinct that would impress Machiavelli himself. She preemptively visited the king, throwing herself on his mercy with tears and protestations that she had only ever engaged him in religious discourse to distract him from his physical suffering and to learn from his superior wisdom. Whether Henry actually believed this performance or simply preferred not to admit he'd been manipulated by courtiers is unclear, but the result was the same. Catherine was spared, her enemies temporarily thwarted. When Henry VIII finally relinquished his grip on both throne and life in January 1547, Catherine might reasonably have celebrated her survival and retreated to comfortable widow's quarters. She had served 4 years in a marriage that must often have felt like navigating a ship through perpetually stormy seas. Instead, with Henry barely cold in his grave, she took perhaps her most daring step, pursuing personal happiness. Within months of the king's death, Catherine married Thomas Seymour, the man she had wanted all along. Their union, while personally fulfilling, proved politically reckless. Seymour, charming but impulsive, had accumulated powerful enemies, including his own brother Edward Seymour, who served as Lord Protector to the young King Edward VI. More damaging still were Thomas's inappropriate behaviors toward the 14-year-old Princess Elizabeth, who resided in Catherine's household. The precise nature of these improprieties remains historically debated, but contemporaneous accounts suggest morning visits to the princess's bedchamber, playful but increasingly intimate roughhousing, and a growing familiarity that Catherine herself eventually discovered and halted. The scenario created a painful triangle. A middle-aged woman who had finally claimed her heart's desire, only to find him seemingly infatuated with her brilliant teenage stepdaughter. Catherine's response was complex and human. She first participated in some of these games, perhaps attempting to normalize what she sensed was inappropriate. Later, she removed Elizabeth from her household, protecting the princess's reputation, while suffering the humiliation of acknowledging her husband's questionable behavior. Despite these shadows, Catherine experienced one joy long denied her: motherhood. In August 1548, at age 36, she gave birth to a daughter, Mary. What should have been her crowning happiness became her final chapter. Days after the birth, Catherine developed puerperal fever, the same postpartum infection that had claimed the life of Jane Seymour. On September 5th, 1548, Catherine Parr, who had survived a nearly disastrous union with the most dangerous man in England, died from this common complication of Tudor childbirth. Thomas Seymour would not long outlive her, his ambitions unchecked by Catherine's steadying influence. He engaged in increasingly desperate political schemes and was executed for treason within months of her death. Their infant daughter disappears from historical records, likely perishing in early childhood. Catherine Parr never sought the spotlight of queenship. Yet when thrust upon the Tudor stage, she performed her role with extraordinary grace under pressure. She was neither the most famous of Henry's wives, nor the most tragic, nor the most scandalous. But she was arguably the most effective. She wielded influence not through dramatics, but through intelligence, patience, and genuine compassion. Her legacy extends far beyond her brief tenure as queen. She helped reunite a fractured royal family, provided crucial maternal guidance to the future Queen Elizabeth I, and demonstrated that female intellectual achievement need not come at the expense of political skill. She published works that advanced Reformed religion in England, survived the deadliest marital lottery in history, and ultimately chose love, however imperfect its outcome. In a reign defined by Henry VIII's outsized personality and appetites, Catherine Parr carved out a space for feminine wisdom and quiet authority. She navigated religious revolution and court intrigue with equal dexterity. She read banned books, debated theologians, raised future monarchs, and left her distinct mark on English history not through birth or beauty, but through the power of her mind and the strength of her character. And so concludes the saga of Henry VIII's 6 queens, 6 women whose lives became eternally intertwined with a king's desperate quest for a male heir, for immortality through dynasty, and perhaps for a love his own nature made impossible to sustain. Some he discarded, some he destroyed. One outlived him, but all endure in history's annals, not merely as consorts defined by their connection to a king, but as women of substance whose stories stand as testament to female resilience in an age when queens were pawns, prizes, and occasionally, if they were as clever as Catherine Parr, power brokers in their own right. After traversing the winding paths of Henry VIII's marital saga, we arrive at the doorstep of its first living consequence, Mary Tudor, a princess born from a union that began in splendor and ended in bitter exile. She was the child conceived in hope, raised in privilege, and then forged in the crucible of rejection. Pull your velvet cloak closer, for this tale carries the chill of sorrow, the warmth of unexpected triumph, and the smoldering embers of misunderstood conviction. Long before history branded her with the crimson-stained epithet Bloody Mary, there existed a little girl with copper-gold hair that caught the sunlight like polished sovereigns. Born on February 18th, 1516, at Greenwich Palace amid celebration and thanksgiving, Mary Tudor arrived as the cherished daughter of King Henry VIII and Queen Catherine of Aragon. Though she was not the male heir her father had prayed for through years of stillbirths and infant deaths, for a time at least, she was embraced as England's treasure, the pearl of the Tudor dynasty. Her early childhood unfolded like an illuminated manuscript, each page more golden than the last. Little Princess Mary dwelled in chambers draped with the finest fabrics, attended by carefully selected ladies who doted upon her every need. Henry, still young and hopeful for sons to come, indulged his daughter with paternal pride. Reports from ambassadors described a precocious child with delicate features, who carried herself with remarkable dignity even before her 5th year. Mary's education was extraordinary for a girl of her era, or indeed, for most nobles regardless of gender. Henry and Catherine, both passionate believers in humanist learning, ensured their daughter received instruction fit for a future sovereign. Under the guidance of the Spanish scholar Juan Luis Vives, who wrote his educational treatise, De Institutione Femini Christiani, specifically for her, Mary mastered Latin by age 9, spoke fluent French and passable Italian, studied Greek, and developed remarkable proficiency in music. She played the virginals and lute with such skill that visitors to court commented on her performances with genuine admiration, rather than obligatory flattery. Catherine of Aragon, herself raised in the scholarly court of Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain, supervised her daughter's religious instruction with particular care. Mary absorbed her mother's deep Catholic devotion like a sapling drawing water, her faith becoming the taproot that would both sustain and complicate her entire existence. For the young princess, the rituals of her religion, the Latin Mass, the saints' days celebrations, the rosary beads passing through small fingers were not merely duties but comforts, frameworks that gave order to her world. When Mary was just 9 years old, whispers began circulating through the drafty corridors of England's palaces. Whispers about her father's growing obsession with a dark-eyed lady-in-waiting named Anne Boleyn, about scruples concerning his marriage to Catherine, about papal dispensations and biblical prohibitions. The ground beneath the princess began to shift, though she could scarcely comprehend why. By the time Mary reached 11, what had begun as court gossip erupted into dynastic earthquake. Henry, convinced that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by God, as evidenced by their failure to produce a living son. Pursued annulment with single-minded determination. Catherine, equally determined to defend the validity of their union and her daughter's legitimacy, stood firm against king and country. Caught between these titans was Mary, watching in bewildered horror as her secure world disintegrated piece by piece. The years that followed inflicted wounds upon Mary's psyche that never truly healed. She witnessed her beloved mother banished from court, stripped of her title, and separated from her only child. Messages smuggled between mother and daughter sustained them both, but could not prevent the final separation when, in 1536, Catherine died alone at Kimbolton Castle, forbidden even a final embrace with her daughter. Meanwhile, Mary herself, once England's treasured princess, once betrothed to emperors and kings, found herself declared illegitimate through the Act of Succession, downgraded to Lady Mary, and forced to yield her place to the infant Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman Mary viewed as her mother's usurper and her own tormentor. The psychological cruelty inflicted upon the teenage Mary is difficult to overstate. She was removed from her own household, assigned servants who reported her every word to Thomas Cromwell, and eventually made to serve in the household of the half-sister who had replaced her. Anne Boleyn, perhaps fearing Mary as a rival to her own daughter, treated the former princess with calculated disdain. Throughout these tribulations, Catherine counseled her daughter from afar to stand firm, to refuse acknowledgement of Anne as queen or of Henry's break with Rome. And Mary obeyed, displaying remarkable courage for one so young and vulnerable. Even when threatened with the Tower, a place from which many never emerged, she maintained that she was the king's legitimate daughter, that her mother had been his true wife, and that the Pope remained the head of Christ's church on earth. This resistance came at terrible cost. Mary lived in constant fear, under such stress that she developed chronic health problems that would plague her for life. Debilitating headaches, irregular menstrual cycles that caused weeks of pain, and stomach ailments that left her periodically incapacitated. Modern physicians might diagnose stress-induced disorders, perhaps even endometriosis, but in Tudor England, these were simply crosses to bear. Anne Boleyn's fall and execution in 1536 brought Mary no immediate relief. Though her most visible enemy was gone, her father remained unreconciled, and his new queen, Jane Seymour, made Mary's restoration to favor conditional upon her submission. Bereft of her mother's support and physically ill, Mary finally broke. She signed documents acknowledging her father as supreme head of the Church of England and her own illegitimacy. This capitulation, though politically necessary, created a spiritual wound that festered within Mary's conscience. She had betrayed her mother's memory and her own deeply held beliefs. The guilt of this surrender would later fuel her determination never again to compromise her faith, regardless of consequences. Jane Seymour's kindness and the birth of Prince Edward brought modest improvements to Mary's status. She was welcomed back to court, given proper apartments, and treated with the respect due a king's daughter, if not a princess. the subsequent queens, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and finally Catherine Parr, treated Mary with varying degrees of cordiality, with Parr in particular making genuine efforts to unite Henry's fractured family. Yet Mary remained fundamentally alone, a Catholic relic in an increasingly Protestant court. When Henry VIII died in 1547, and her 9-year-old half-brother became Edward VI, Mary found herself once again swimming against the religious tide. Under Edward's regents, first Edward Seymour and later John Dudley, England moved firmly toward Protestant reforms that Mary viewed as heretical innovations. The young king, indoctrinated from birth in reformist theology and encouraged by zealous advisors, pressured his older sister to abandon the Mass. Mary refused, claiming the private worship exemption Henry had granted her. Standoffs ensued, with Mary's household priests arrested and her chaplains intimidated. Yet she persisted, sometimes hearing Mass in secret, risking genuine danger to remain true to the faith that had become both her comfort and her identity. These years taught Mary survival in the shadows. She developed a careful diplomacy, maintaining her religious principles while avoiding open confrontation when possible. She retreated to her country estates, particularly Framlingham Castle in Suffolk, where she cultivated loyal supporters and waited, perhaps sensing that her brother's frail health might one day open a path to power. Edward's death in July 1553, at age 15, triggered a succession crisis that few had anticipated so soon. The young king, manipulated by the Duke of Northumberland, had attempted to exclude both his sisters from the throne through a device for the succession that named his Protestant cousin Lady Jane Grey as heir. When Edward breathed his last, Northumberland moved swiftly to secure Jane's position, proclaiming her queen while keeping news of Edward's death temporarily secret. The moment crystallized all of Mary's decades of suffering into a single point of decision. She could accept this final indignity, retreating perhaps to a life of private devotion, or she could fight. The woman who had learned to bend in order, not to break now, found her steel. Evading capture by Northumberland's men, Mary fled to East Anglia, where her family had long held lands and commanded loyalty. From Kenninghall and then Framlingham Castle, she declared herself the rightful Queen of England and called for supporters to rally to her standard. The response astonished her enemies. Common people and nobles alike flocked to her cause. Catholics saw in her the hope of religious restoration, but many Protestants, too, recognized her legitimate claim by birth. Ships sent to intercept her instead declared for her. Town after town proclaimed Mary queen. By August, even London had abandoned Jane Grey, and Mary rode into her capital triumphant, the first woman to claim England's throne in her own right rather than as consort. For a fleeting moment, it seemed Mary's long years of suffering had culminated in miraculous vindication. She pardoned most of those who had supported Jane Grey, including Jane herself initially. She released political prisoners of her brother's reign. She promised not to force religion upon her subjects' consciences. a remarkable pledge for the 16th century. England celebrated its new queen with genuine enthusiasm, seeing in her the blood of the popular Henry VIII, and hoping for stability after the turbulent minority of Edward VI. But ruling proved more complex than surviving. Mary, now 37, had spent her life responding to others' agendas rather than forming her own. She had been schooled in languages, music, and theology, but not in statecraft. Moreover, she inherited a government staffed primarily with Protestant officials, and a church transformed by reforms she considered heretical. Her first priority became clear quickly: marriage. As a female monarch in an age when women were considered too weak and emotionally unstable to rule independently, Mary believed she needed a husband to secure her position and provide an heir. Her choice fell upon Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V, who had been her mother's nephew and her own childhood betrothal at one point. This decision, though personally appealing to Mary, who saw in it a reconnection with her mother's Spanish heritage, proved politically disastrous. The English people, fiercely suspicious of foreign influence, recoiled at the prospect of a Spanish king consort. Despite careful treaty provisions limiting Philip's power in England, rebellions broke out, most notably Wyatt's rebellion in 1554, which implicated Mary's half-sister Elizabeth and resulted in the execution of Lady Jane Grey, who had become a potential figurehead for Protestant opposition. Philip arrived in England in July 1554, and by all accounts, Mary fell deeply in love with her husband. He was 11 years her junior, conventionally handsome, and carried himself with Habsburg majesty. That Philip did not return her affection with equal fervor became painfully apparent to everyone at court, except perhaps Mary herself. He performed his conjugal duties adequately, but his attention remained fixed on the broader Habsburg political agenda rather than on his wife or her realm. Meanwhile, Mary turned to what she considered her divine mission: the restoration of England to Catholicism. Parliament repealed Edward's religious legislation, and papal authority was formally restored. The married clergy were removed from their livings, Latin Mass returned to parish churches, and Protestant texts were banned. Most controversially, the heresy laws were revived. It was this last action that would cement Mary's historical reputation. Beginning in 1555, her government began trying prominent Protestant leaders for heresy. The first to burn was John Rogers in February, followed by Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley in October. Most famous was Thomas Cranmer, former Archbishop of Canterbury and architect of Henry VIII's annulment from Catherine of Aragon, who was executed in March 1556 after a dramatic recantation and subsequent reaffirmation of his Protestant beliefs. By the end of Mary's reign, nearly 300 Protestants had been burned at the stake. These executions, vividly depicted in John Fox's later Book of Martyrs, would earn her the sobriquet Bloody Mary, and color historical perceptions of her reign for centuries. Yet by 16th century standards, Mary was no more bloodthirsty than other monarchs. Her father had executed thousands for treason and other offenses. Her sister Elizabeth would later execute hundreds of Catholics. The Spanish Inquisition and continental religious persecutions claimed far more lives. What distinguished Mary's persecutions in public memory was their public nature, their religious rather than political justification, and the effective propaganda produced by Protestant writers who survived her reign. Mary genuinely believed she was saving souls by purging heresy, viewing the temporary suffering of the body as preferable to eternal damnation. This perspective, while alien to modern sensibilities, was entirely consistent with medieval Catholic theology. As religious tensions intensified, Mary faced personal heartbreak. In 1555, she believed herself pregnant. Her belly swelled. She experienced morning sickness and other symptoms, and the court prepared for the birth of an heir. Philip even delayed his departure for the continent to await the child's arrival. But months passed, and no baby came. What Mary had experienced was likely a phantom pregnancy, a psychosomatic condition where intense desire for a child produces physical symptoms of pregnancy, or possibly the beginning stages of the uterine or ovarian cancer that would eventually kill her. A second false pregnancy followed in 1557, more embarrassing than the first. Philip, who had briefly returned to England hoping for an heir, departed again, this time permanently. Though they remained married and corresponded, he never again set foot in England during Mary's lifetime. Mary's final years were marked by escalating problems. War with France, undertaken to support Philip's Habsburg interests, resulted in the loss of Calais in January 1558, England's last territorial possession on the continent, and a symbolic blow that Mary felt keenly, reportedly saying that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. Her health deteriorated rapidly throughout 1558. She suffered from headaches, depression, and vision problems. Her abdomen swelled with what modern doctors suspect was ovarian cysts or cancer. By autumn, the Queen knew she was dying and was forced to recognize her Protestant half-sister Elizabeth as heir. Despite fears that Elizabeth would undo her Catholic restoration, on November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor died at St. James's Palace, aged 42 years. She had reigned for just 5 years and 4 months, a brief, troubled tenure that would be overshadowed by the long, glorious reign of her successor. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, and years later Elizabeth would be laid to rest beside her. The sisters united in death as they never were in life. History has not been kind to Mary Tudor. For centuries, she was portrayed as a religious zealot, a Spanish puppet, a bitter and infertile woman whose brief reign represented a regressive interlude between the glories of the Henrician Reformation and the Elizabethan Golden Age. Yet modern historians have begun to reassess Mary's legacy, recognizing in her a woman of principle who remained true to her convictions despite tremendous pressure to abandon them. They note her administrative accomplishments, currency reform, naval expansion, and commercial treaties that Elizabeth would later build upon. They point to her patronage of music and education, and her genuine concern for the poor. Above all, they recognize that Mary Tudor paved the way for female monarchy in England. She demonstrated that a woman could claim the throne by hereditary right, command armies, preside over Parliament, and make decisions of state. Without Mary's precedent, Elizabeth's succession might have faced far greater opposition. Mary Tudor was neither saint nor monster, but something far more complex. A human being shaped by trauma, guided by faith, limited by her time, and ultimately defeated by circumstances beyond her control. She was the daughter of a rejected queen who became a queen herself, the discarded princess who reclaimed her birthright, and the maligned Catholic in a Protestant narrative who remained steadfast to her final breath. And now, as the candles burn low on Mary's tale, do not let them be extinguished, but rather watch how they flare brighter. For from the ashes of Mary's reign would rise her half-sister, the flame-haired queen who would transform England's defeat into a golden age of exploration, literature, and defiance. Elizabeth Tudor waits in the wings of history, ready to step onto the stage her sister has vacated. In the gilded chambers of Greenwich Palace, beneath the gentle slant of autumn light and the whispers of a world that always demanded more, a child's first cry slipped into the air on the 7th of September, 1533. Elizabeth Tudor entered the world not in a blaze of triumphant joy, but in a haze of quiet disappointment. She was a girl, an undeniable, unmistakable girl, not the son for whom her father, King Henry VIII, had torn his kingdom apart, abandoning his once cherished queen and defying the might of Rome itself. But a daughter, red-haired, with her mother's sharp eyes and her father's fierce Tudor blood. Her mother was Anne Boleyn, the brilliant, ambitious woman whose rise had shattered the old order. Once the enchantress of the court, a queen whose laughter was bright as summer, now a woman whose throne teetered on a knife's edge. For Anne, Elizabeth was a promise, a golden future that would cement her position. But for Henry, whose dreams of a strong male heir were a feverish obsession, she was a reminder of all that he had risked and all that he had not yet gained. Elizabeth's earliest memories were painted with shadows. When she was barely 3, her mother's head fell beneath the swift, indifferent blade of an executioner's sword. The woman who had once been queen became a ghost, a whispered warning against ambition. Elizabeth's title of princess was stripped away. Her legitimacy declared a lie by a father who could no longer bear the sight of his own regret. She was sent away, shuffled from one household to another, a child of royal blood but marked with a stigma she had not earned. Yet even in this exile, her spirit was not crushed. Her sharp, curious mind found solace in books and in the careful words of her tutors. Latin and Greek became her playthings, history her companion. She grew not just in years, but in understanding, watching the brutal theater of her father's court from a distance, a world where crowns were earned not by birthright, but by survival. Her father died when she was 13, and her young half-brother Edward took the throne, a boy king, manipulated by ambitious men who pulled his strings with whispered promises. Elizabeth watched from the edges, neither favored nor forgotten, and when Edward's brief, tragic reign ended, she found herself in the shadow of her elder sister Mary, a queen whose fervent Catholic faith burned as fiercely as her suspicions. Elizabeth's life became a tightrope. She was a Protestant symbol, a threat to a queen who saw her as the embodiment of heresy. Imprisoned in the Tower of London, locked within the same cold walls that had once held her mother, she learned the art of survival in silence. Carefully worded letters, humble pleas, and a relentless refusal to surrender hope kept her alive when so many whispered of her doom. And then Mary died, childless and embittered, her hopes for a Catholic England fading with her final breath. Elizabeth, slender and watchful, with her red hair glowing like a flame in the winter light, rode into London not merely as a queen, but as a survivor who had outlived her enemies and endured the tempests of ambition and fear. Her reign was a dance, a glittering, dangerous dance upon a stage watched by all of Europe. Her council was a gallery of brilliant men, William Cecil, the anchor of her policy, Francis Walsingham, her silent dagger in the world of espionage, Robert Dudley, her cherished companion, whose whispered words stirred rumors but never quite became promises. She used the prospect of her hand in marriage as a weapon, keeping kings and princes on a leash of hope. Under her, England bloomed. It was not just a kingdom, but a stage, where Shakespeare's words echoed and Drake's ships plundered Spanish gold. It was a place where poets painted with language, and explorers sketched the edges of the known world. A golden age, they would call it, though in truth it was an age of blood and brilliance, of secrets and splendor. But for all her power, Elizabeth remained alone. She wore the crown like a shield, her powdered face a mask, her court a glittering prison. She was the virgin queen, wedded to her people, but always apart from them. Her laughter grew rarer, her trusted friends fewer. She had built an empire on her strength. Yet in the quiet of her chambers, beneath the crushing weight of duty and memory, she was just Elizabeth, one woman, fragile and fierce. When she died in 1603, after 44 years of rule, she left behind no child to carry her blood, but she left a kingdom that had risen with her, a legend that would outlast her flesh. Elizabeth was not just a queen, she was a story of survival, of ambition tempered by caution, of brilliance wrapped in enigma. The girl born a disappointment became the woman who defined an age.